Sometimes I wonder if my life would have unfolded differently if I'd actually read the documents that day. If I'd questioned the papers my parents slid across the mahogany dining table when I was 22 instead of signing them with blind trust. But back then, I still believed that if I was good enough, responsible enough, and patient enough, they would eventually see my worth the same way they saw my brother's. I grew up in a sprawling colonial-style house in Oak Ridge Heights. We weren't just wealthy, we were old money wealthy. The kind where summer meant trips to our lake house and winter meant skiing in Aspen. My father, Richard Montgomery, built his investment firm from a modest inheritance, turning it into a financial empire that managed portfolios for half the city's elite. My mother, Eleanor, was the perfect corporate wife, immaculately dressed, chairing charity galas, and maintaining our social standing with the precision of a military strategist. Then there was my younger brother, Ethan, 3 years my junior, but eternally my parents' golden child. While I excelled in academics, graduating valedictorian and earning a full scholarship to Princeton, Ethan struggled through school with a string of C's and disciplinary issues that my parents dismissed as boys being boys and creative energy. His mediocrity was always framed as special, his failures repackaged as unique perspectives. "Not everyone follows conventional paths, Claire," my mother would say, her voice smooth as honey, but with a sting at the end. "Ethan sees the world differently. That's what will make him exceptional in business." I still remember the day Ethan totaled his first car, a brand new BMW my parents gave him for his 16th birthday. I had received driving lessons and access to the family's oldest vehicle when I turned 16. But for Ethan, only something shiny and new would do. When he wrapped that car around a tree after racing with friends, my parents didn't scold him. Instead, my father clapped his shoulder and said, "Well, son, expensive lesson. Let's get you something safer next time." They bought him another one the following week, a Mercedes. Despite the constant reminders of my secondary status, I loved my family. I worked hard to make them proud, believing that eventually my dedication would be recognized. I took summer internships at my father's firm, learning the business from the ground up while Ethan spent those same summers finding himself across Europe and Asia, all expenses paid. When I graduated college, I moved back home temporarily, taking an entry-level position at Montgomery Investments while studying for my MBA at night. Meanwhile, Ethan had dropped out of 3 different universities, each more expensive than the last. "College just isn't for everyone," my father said, as if this was a profound insight rather than an excuse. The real shock came when I overheard my parents discussing Ethan's trust fund one evening. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. I was passing by my father's study when I heard the figure, $100,000, to be released to Ethan on his 25th birthday. "He needs a proper start in life," my father was saying, "something to help him establish himself." My mother murmured agreement. "It's a substantial sum, but he'll need it more than Claire. She's always been so. Capable. That word again. The double-edged compliment that somehow always left me with less rather than more. I stood there, frozen in the hallway, a strange numbness spreading through my chest. I'd been working 60-hour weeks between my job and studies, taking on student loans for my MBA while living at home to save money. And all this time there was a trust fund being set up for my brother, who had contributed nothing to his own advancement and had shown zero financial responsibility. The next morning at breakfast, I casually asked my father about family trusts, pretending I'd read something relevant in my financial planning class. "It's important to set these things up properly," he said vaguely, not meeting my eyes. "Everyone's needs are different." "Do we have family trusts?" I pressed, trying to keep my voice light. My father exchanged a look with my mother. "We have various financial instruments in place for both of you," he said finally. "Nothing for you to worry about." Nothing for me to worry about because there was nothing for me. That was the unspoken truth hanging in the air between us. A week later, they called me into the dining room. Several documents lay spread across the table. "These are some standard liability waivers for the family assets," my father explained. "Just housekeeping. Your brother will sign his set when he's back from Bali." I should have read them carefully. I should have asked questions. But years of conditioning to be the good daughter, the responsible one, had taught me to comply first and consider my own interests last. So I signed where they pointed, not realizing I was signing away any claim to contest the unequal distribution of family assets, or at least, that's what they intended me to do. 2 years passed after that day at the dining room table. I completed my MBA, graduated with honors, and secured a promotion at Montgomery Investments, not because of my last name, but despite it. My father seemed determined to ensure I earned every scrap of respect in the company. I handled the smaller client portfolios, the ones other advisors found too tedious or not profitable enough. Yet I built those accounts methodically, growing them at rates that began to turn heads in the office. Meanwhile, Ethan returned from his travels with a tan, a man bun, and a 23-year-old yoga instructor named Willow, who he'd met at a silent retreat in Bali. My parents welcomed Willow into our home with enthusiastic approval, despite her habit of rearranging the furniture according to feng shui principles and burning sage in every room to clear the negative energy. "Isn't she wonderful?" my mother whispered to me one evening as we watched Willow coach Ethan through a headstand in the living room. "She's really bringing out his spiritual side." I bit my tongue to avoid pointing out that Ethan's spiritual side seemed to involve spending more of our parents' money while contributing absolutely nothing to society or even his own upkeep. Instead, I smiled tightly and excused myself to review client files in my room. That night, I overheard another conversation, this one between my father and Mr. Winters, his oldest friend and the family attorney. They were in the study, their voices carrying faintly through the partially open door as I passed. "The trust fund paperwork is all in order," Mr. Winters was saying. "Ethan will have access to the full amount when he turns 25 next month." "Good, good," my father replied. "Eleanor's been concerned he might blow through it too quickly. Is there any way to structure the distributions?" "Not without rewriting the trust, Richard, and that would delay things significantly. Besides, the boy's gotta learn financial responsibility sometime." I nearly laughed out loud at this. When exactly had my parents ever expected Ethan to learn financial responsibility? Was it when they replaced his destroyed BMW? Or when they continued paying his credit card bills despite him exceeding his limit 3 months in a row? Or perhaps when they bought him first-class tickets to find himself in the most expensive travel destinations in the world? Mr. Winters continued, "What about Claire? Have you considered setting something up for her as well?" There was a pause, and I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall. "Claire doesn't need that kind of help," my father finally said. "She's doing fine on her own. She's got a good head for business. Reminds me of myself at that age." "Still, Richard, equal treatment of heirs tends to prevent complications down the road." My father chuckled. "Don't worry about that. Claire signed the liability waivers. Besides, she's never been the type to make demands. Always been sensible, our Claire. Sensible, responsible, capable." The words echoed in my head, no longer sounding like compliments but like justifications for giving me less, for expecting more from me while handing everything to Ethan. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by academic trophies and honor roll certificates, tangible proof of years spent trying to earn what came to my brother automatically, my parents' esteem. The next morning, I made a decision. I would find those documents I had signed and see exactly what they contained. Not out of greed, though the inequality stung, but because I needed to understand the truth about my place in this family. It took 3 days of careful searching while my parents were out before I found the files in my father's desk. The drawer wasn't locked. Why would it be? The thought that I might snoop would never occur to them. Good, responsible Claire wouldn't do something so underhanded. But good, responsible Claire was starting to question everything. I spread the papers across my bed, reading each one carefully this time. Most were exactly what my father had claimed: standard liability waivers regarding family property and investments. But the last document gave me pause. It referenced a family trust, the Montgomery Family Legacy Trust, and included provisions for both Ethan and me. According to this document, the trust had been established when we were children, with equal allocations for both of us. Ethan's portion was indeed scheduled for distribution on his 25th birthday, but mine had a different condition attached. Claire Montgomery's portion shall be distributed upon her 30th birthday, or upon the establishment of her independent household, whichever comes first. I read the clause 3 times, my hand shaking. There it was in black and white. I hadn't been excluded after all. I'd been held to a different standard, yes, but my portion existed, and it would be released when I either turned 30 or moved out and established my own home. The revelation stunned me into stillness. All this time, I'd believed I was being passed over, when in reality, my parents had simply set different expectations for each of us. They expected Ethan to need financial support to establish himself. They expected me to remain at home, working, for the family business, never striking out on my own. They had created a self-fulfilling prophecy, treating me as the perpetually responsible daughter who would always be there, always be reliable, always put family first. And I had fulfilled that role perfectly, never questioning, never demanding, never even considering a life outside the path they had subtly laid out for me. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with implications. The trust document revealed something beyond just the money. It exposed the narrative my parents had constructed around my life without my knowledge or consent. They had written my story, cast me in the role of the eternally responsible daughter who would forever orbit the family, while Ethan was given the freedom to explore and fail and still be rewarded. I got up before dawn and went for a run, something I hadn't done in months due to my packed work schedule. The rhythmic pounding of my feet on pavement helped clear my head as the sun slowly rose over Oak Ridge Heights. By the time I returned home, I had a plan. At breakfast, my mother commented on my flushed appearance. "You look energized this morning." "Claire, did you sleep well?" "Actually, I've been thinking," I said, pouring myself coffee. "It might be time for me to look for my own place." The silence that followed was deafening. My father lowered his newspaper, and my mother's fork paused midway to her mouth. Even Ethan, who rarely paid attention to family conversations, glanced up from his phone. "But why?" my mother finally asked. "You've got everything you need here, and it makes financial sense to save while you're building your career." "I'm 27, Mom. Most people my age don't live with their parents. Most people your age aren't as sensible as you," my father countered, folding his newspaper precisely. "Besides, you're on track for partnership at the firm. Why complicate things now?" I took a sip of coffee, noting how quickly they moved to discourage the very independence they had supposedly built into my trust conditions. "I think having my own space would be good for me. I found a few places downtown that look promising." "Downtown?" My mother said the word as if I'd suggested moving to a war zone. "It's so urban. And the crime rates—" "I'll be fine, Mom. The building has security, and it's in the renovated arts district." "This seems rather impulsive," my father said, his tone shifting to the one he used with difficult clients. "Why don't you take some time to consider the practical aspects? Housing in this area is expensive. You'd be better off waiting until you have more substantial savings." I met his gaze steadily. "Actually, I've done the math. With my salary and bonus from last quarter, I can comfortably afford it." What I didn't say was that I had also done the math on what my portion of the trust fund might be. If it matched Ethan's $100,000, it would certainly make establishing my independent household much easier. But that wasn't my primary motivation. The truth was, discovering the hidden clause had awakened something in me. A realization that I had been complicit in my own containment. My father cleared his throat. Well, if you're determined, I suppose we should discuss this more fully. Perhaps we can look at options in some of the neighborhoods closer to home. There's that new development near the country club. I've already scheduled viewings for this weekend, I replied, standing to rinse my coffee cup. You're welcome to join me if you'd like. I left for work before they could respond, feeling strangely lighter than I had in years. The apartment I chose wasn't in my father's preferred neighborhood near the country club. It was a loft in a converted textile factory downtown with exposed brick walls, massive windows, and a view of the river. It was nothing like the traditional, carefully decorated rooms of my parents' house, and that was precisely why I loved it. When I brought my parents to see it after signing the lease, my mother's expression was a study in conflicted emotions. It's certainly unique, she managed, surveying the open floor plan and industrial fixtures. But don't you think it's a bit stark? And all these windows? Anyone could see in. That's what curtains are for, Mom, I said, smiling as I gazed out at the city skyline. And I like that it's a blank canvas. I can make it completely my own. My father had been unusually quiet during the tour, but as we were leaving, he pulled me aside while my mother waited at the elevator. Claire, he began, his voice lower than usual. I hope you know what you're doing. This area of town is still developing. The investment might not be sound. I'm renting, Dad, not buying, and I'm not looking at this as an investment. It's my home. He studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You've changed recently. Ever since you mentioned moving out, you've been different. Not different, I corrected him gently. Just more myself. What I didn't tell him was that I had made an appointment with Mr. Winters for the following day. I wanted to understand exactly how and when my portion of the trust would be released, now that I was establishing my independent household. I also wanted to ensure there weren't any other hidden conditions or clauses that might affect my future. Mr. Winters seemed surprised to see me when I walked into his office. Claire, this is unexpected. Your father didn't mention you'd be coming by. My father doesn't know I'm here, I said, taking a seat across from his desk. I'm here about the Montgomery Family Legacy Trust. His eyebrows rose slightly. I see. And what specifically about the trust interests you? The clause regarding my portion being released upon establishment of an independent household. I've just signed a lease on an apartment downtown. I'd like to understand the process for accessing those funds. Mr. Winters removed his glasses, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief, a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time. Claire, I'm not sure how you became aware of the specific terms, but I read the documents, I said simply. The ones I signed 2 years ago. He replaced his glasses, his expression shifting from surprise to something like respect. I see. Well, there is a verification process. The trust requires proof of independence, lease agreement, utility bills in your name, evidence that you're genuinely establishing a separate household and not just nominally moving out. And once that's verified, then yes, your portion would be released to you, the same amount as your brother's. I nodded, a sense of validation washing over me. And there are no other conditions I should be aware of. No other hidden clauses. Regarding my inheritance or position in the family? Mr. Winters sighed, leaning back in his chair. Claire, I've known your family since before you were born. Your parents. They've always had different expectations for you and Ethan. Not because they value you less, but because they trust you more. Trust shouldn't mean receiving less, I said quietly. It shouldn't mean having different rules. No, he admitted after a moment. Perhaps it shouldn't. Moving day arrived on a crisp autumn Saturday. I had expected to handle everything alone. I'd hired movers and hadn't asked my family for help. But to my surprise, my mother showed up at the house as I was labeling the last few boxes. "I thought you might need these," she said, holding out a set of crystal wine glasses wrapped in newspaper. "They were your grandmother's. She would have wanted you to have them." The gesture caught me off guard. "Thank you," I managed, carefully taking the bundle. She glanced around my nearly empty bedroom, her eyes lingering on the bare walls where certificates and academic awards had hung for years. "I always knew you'd fly the nest eventually. I just thought—" She trailed off, adjusting her pearl necklace. "You thought what, Mom?" "That you'd leave for something bigger. A promotion in another city, perhaps. Or marriage." She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her linen pants. "Not just an apartment downtown." I placed the wine glasses in a box labeled kitchen and sealed it with packing tape. "This isn't about the apartment. It's about making my own choices." "I suppose that's fair," she conceded, though her tone suggested she thought it anything. "But still, your father and I worry. The timing seems peculiar." "Peculiar how?" "Well, with Ethan's birthday next week and the trust fund distribution, people might talk." There it was, the real concern. Not my well-being or independence, but how my actions might appear to others, how they might reflect on the family. Classic Eleanor Montgomery. "Let them talk," I said, lifting the box and heading toward the stairs. "I've made my decision." The movers finished loading my belongings around noon. As they pulled away from the house, my father emerged from his study, where he'd been conspicuously absent all morning. "So you're really going through with this?" he said, hands in his pockets as he surveyed the driveway. "Did you think I wouldn't?" he shrugged. "You've always been sensible, Claire. I thought you'd reconsider once you'd had time to think it through." "I've had plenty of time to think," I replied, taking my purse and car keys from the hall table. 27 years, in fact," his brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I hesitated, weighing my words carefully. Part of me wanted to confront him about the trust, about the unequal expectations, about everything I'd discovered. But another part recognized that this moment, my departure, wasn't the time for that conversation. "It means I'm grateful for everything you and Mom have given me," I said instead. "But now it's time for me to give myself something too." He seemed to relax slightly, misinterpreting my words as conciliatory rather than declarative. "Well, remember you always have a place here if things don't work out." The assumption that my independence might fail grated on me, but I simply nodded and headed to my car. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught sight of my parents in the rearview mirror, my mother waving half-heartedly, my father already turning back toward the house. The loft felt cavernous that first night. My furniture, which had seemed substantial, in my bedroom at home, looked almost comically small in the open space. The exposed beams creaked occasionally, and street noise filtered up from below, all sounds I wasn't used to after years in the quiet suburb. Yet despite the echoing emptiness, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This space was mine. Every decision about it, from the location to the furniture arrangement to what time I went to bed, belonged solely to me. I celebrated with takeout Thai food and a bottle of wine, sitting cross-legged on the floor since my dining table wouldn't be delivered until the following week. As I raised a toast to myself and my new beginning, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Heard you moved out. Bold move, sis. Parents freaking. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate or jailbreak?" I smiled despite myself. For all his faults, Ethan had never been malicious, just spoiled and enabled. And he was the only one who seemed to recognize my move as a positive step rather than a puzzling misstep. "Sure. My place at 7. Bring wine." The following day, I unpacked methodically, arranging my belongings with care. Around mid-afternoon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Montgomery?" This is Alicia from Winters and Associates. Mr. Winters asked me to call and confirm your appointment for Monday at 10 a.m. regarding the trust verification process. Thank you, Alicia. Please tell Mr. Winters I'll be there. After hanging up, I sat on my newly assembled couch, contemplating what Monday might bring. Part of me felt guilty for accessing the trust this way, as if I were somehow being sneaky. But then I reminded myself, this was my money, set aside for me from the beginning. I wasn't taking anything that wasn't rightfully mine. I was simply claiming it on my own terms, rather than waiting for my parents to decide I was deserving. Ethan arrived that evening with not one but 3 bottles of wine and a housewarming gift. A rather hideous abstract painting that I suspected he'd purchased from one of Willow's artist friends. "This place is seriously cool," he said, wandering around the loft with unconcealed admiration. "Way better than that sterile mansion we grew up in." "It's home," I said simply, pouring us each a glass of wine. He flopped onto my couch, kicking his feet up on my coffee table, a habit that had always driven our mother crazy. "So what finally did it? What made you break free from the Montgomery family fortress?" I considered deflecting, giving him some vague answer about independence or personal growth. But something about the genuine curiosity in his expression made me decide on honesty. "I found out about the trust fund, Ethan. Yours and mine." He froze, wine glass halfway to his lips. "Oh. Yeah. Oh." He set his glass down carefully. "Look, if you're mad about me getting mine first—" "I'm not mad at you," I interrupted. "You didn't create the conditions, but I am curious. Did you know about my portion? About the clause regarding when I could access it?" Ethan had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Not exactly. I mean, Dad mentioned once that there were provisions for both of us, but he never went into details. I just assumed—" He trailed off. "That I didn't have one?" I supplied. "That the responsible daughter didn't need financial support?" He shrugged, a familiar gesture that suddenly reminded me how young he still was in many ways. "Something like that, I guess. But hey, now you know, right? And you moved out, so you get yours too. Everyone wins." I didn't point out that it wasn't that simple, that the inequality wasn't just about the money but about the expectations, the different standards, the narrative our parents had constructed around each of us. Instead, I raised my glass. "To finding hidden clauses," I said, "and to new beginnings." Ethan clinked his glass against mine, looking relieved that I wasn't pushing the issue further. "To new beginnings. And to my big sister, finally doing something unpredictable for once in her life." Monday morning arrived with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension swirling in my stomach. I dressed carefully in one of my better work suits, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, and arrived at Mr. Winters' office 10 minutes early. His secretary, Alicia, offered me coffee and a practiced smile as I waited. "Claire," Mr. Winters greeted me warmly, emerging from his office precisely at 10 a.m. "Come in, please." His office hadn't changed since my childhood visits. The same leather-bound law books lining mahogany shelves, the same heavy desk, even the same slightly musty smell of paper and wood polish. The only difference was how I felt sitting across from him, no longer a dutiful daughter accompanying her father, but a woman advocating for herself. "I've prepared the verification forms," he said, sliding a folder toward me. "As we discussed, you'll need to provide your lease agreement, proof of utility accounts in your name, and documentation showing you've genuinely established a separate household." I opened my portfolio and handed him copies of everything he'd requested: lease, electric bill, water bill, internet service agreement, even my change of address confirmation from the post office. His eyebrows rose slightly as he reviewed the documents. "You've come prepared." "I usually do," I replied. "It's one of those traits my parents have always counted on." He nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. "These all appear to be in order." I'll need to verify the authenticity, of course, but assuming everything checks out, the funds should be released within 10 business days. And will my parents be notified? Mr. Winters hesitated. As trustees, yes, they will receive documentation of the distribution. I had expected as much, but still felt a twinge of unease at the thought of the conversation that would inevitably follow. I understand. Is there anything else I need to know about the trust or any other family financial matters that might affect me? He regarded me thoughtfully for a moment. Claire, I've known your family for a long time. Your father and I were roommates at Dartmouth. I've watched you and Ethan grow up. And while client confidentiality prevents me from discussing certain details, I will say this. Your parents have always had different visions for their children's futures. Different doesn't necessarily mean unequal in their minds, though I understand how it might appear that way to you. Different has certainly felt unequal from where I'm standing, I said, keeping my voice level despite the emotion rising in my chest. Ethan gets automatic support while I have to literally move out of the family home to access what's mine. Your father believes in you, Claire, perhaps more than you realize. His belief in me has manifested as higher expectations and fewer rewards. That's not exactly comforting. Mr. Winters sighed, removing his glasses and placing them carefully on his desk. May I speak frankly? Not as your family's attorney, but as someone who's known you since you were born? I nodded, curious despite my reservations. Richard Montgomery has always seen himself in you. Not in Ethan, in you. The drive, the intelligence, the natural affinity for business. He's harder on you because he believes you're capable of greatness, while he's never had the same confidence in your brother. Then why the differential treatment? Why give Ethan everything and make me work for scraps? Because he's trying to protect you both in the ways he thinks you need it. Ethan needs financial support because, frankly, your father doesn't trust him to succeed otherwise. You, he believes, need independence and self-reliance because those are the qualities that made Richard himself successful. Mr. Winters leaned forward slightly. I'm not saying it's right or fair, I'm just offering perspective. I absorbed his words, trying to reconcile them with years of feeling secondary, of watching Ethan receive automatic advantages while I earned every achievement through double the effort. Even if that's true, they should have been honest with me. They shouldn't have hidden the trust conditions or let me believe I was being excluded. On that point, I agree completely, Mr. Winters conceded. And for what it's worth, I advised your father to be transparent with both of you from the beginning. As I drove back to my loft afterward, Mr. Winters' words replayed in my mind. The idea that my father saw himself in me, that his treatment was somehow rooted in high expectations rather than lower regard, felt like a perspective shift I wasn't quite ready to accept. Years of feeling like the less favored child couldn't be erased by one conversation, no matter how insightful. When I arrived home, there was a voicemail waiting from my mother. Claire, darling, your father and I would love if you'd join us for dinner this Friday. Nothing formal, just family. Do call back when you can. Her tone was light, almost overly casual, which immediately raised my suspicions. My parents didn't do casual family dinners, especially not on Fridays when they typically attended or hosted social events. Something was up. I returned the call that evening, after giving myself time to consider whether I wanted to accept. Claire. I'm so glad you called back, my mother answered, sounding genuinely pleased. Can you make it Friday? Around 7? What's the occasion, Mom? Does there need to be an occasion to want to see my daughter? When I didn't immediately respond, she sighed. If you must know, Ethan will be receiving his trust fund distribution on Thursday. Your father thought it would be nice to have a small celebration. Of course. They wanted to celebrate Ethan's financial windfall, probably unaware that I was in the process of claiming my own portion of the trust. For a moment, I considered declining, sparing myself the discomfort of watching my brother be lauded once again while I sat in the shadows. But then a different thought emerged. Why not go? Why not be present when they realized I'd discovered the truth? Why not witness firsthand their reaction to my independence? "I'll be there," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself, darling. Though, if you wanted to wear that lovely blue dress you bought for the charity gala last year, it would be nice to see you in something other than those business suits." I almost laughed at her transparent attempt to manage even this small detail of my appearance. "I'll see what I feel like wearing, Mom. See you Friday." After hanging up, I sat on my couch, gazing out at the city lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over downtown. My new home felt like a fortress, not in the cold, imposing way of my parents' house, but in the sense of safety, of having created a space where I could truly be myself. Friday would be challenging, perhaps even uncomfortable, but for the first time, I would be entering my childhood home not as the perpetually accommodating daughter, but as an independent woman who had claimed her rightful place. The thought brought a smile to my face as I raised a glass of wine to the city skyline. "To hidden clauses," I whispered to the empty room, "and to the power of finally reading the fine print." Friday evening arrived with an unexpected autumn rainstorm. I stood on my parents' doorstep, raindrops sliding off my umbrella, and took a deep breath before ringing the bell. I had deliberately chosen not to wear the blue dress my mother suggested, opting instead for a sleek black jumpsuit I'd purchased the day before, something she had never seen, something that represented the new Claire. Our housekeeper, Maria, answered the door with a warm smile. "Miss Claire, so good to see you. Your family is in the sitting room." The house smelled the same, lemon furniture polish and my mother's signature gardenia arrangement in the foyer. But it felt different now, more like a place I was visiting rather than returning to. My heels clicked against the marble floors. As I made my way toward the sitting room, the sound announcing my arrival before I appeared in the doorway. My mother rose immediately, martini in hand. "Claire, darling, you're here." Her eyes flickered briefly over my outfit, registering the rebellion in my wardrobe choice, but her smile remained fixed. "Can I get you a drink?" "White wine would be lovely," I said, accepting kisses on both cheeks. From her. My father nodded from his armchair, barely looking up from his phone. Ethan lounged on the sofa, already on what appeared to be his second scotch, with Willow perched beside him in a flowing maxi dress and an excessive amount of turquoise jewelry. "Nice outfit, sis," Ethan said, raising his glass in my direction. "Very downtown chic." "Thanks," I replied, accepting the wine my mother pressed into my hand. "How does it feel to be officially 25? He grinned. "About $100,000 better than 24. My mother shot him a warning glance. "Ethan, please, we don't discuss finances so crassly." "Why not? We all know why we're here." He glanced at me, a hint of apology in his expression. "Sorry, Claire, no offense." "None taken," I said smoothly, taking a sip of wine. "Congratulations on your trust fund." An awkward silence fell over the room. My mother busied herself adjusting a flower arrangement, while my father finally put down his phone and cleared his throat. "Dinner should be ready soon," he announced. "Claire, I hear the Wilson portfolio is performing exceptionally well under your management." The sudden shift to work talk was so transparent it was almost comical. "Yes, it's up 12% this quarter. Better than projected." "Good, good." He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "I've been considering moving some of the Harrington accounts to your portfolio as well. They're substantial clients." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by this professional vote of confidence. "I'd be happy to take them on." My mother swooped in, clearly uncomfortable with the business discussion. "Let's not talk shop at a family gathering, Richard. Claire, how is your new apartment? Have you settled in?" "It's coming along nicely," I said. "I just got my dining table delivered yesterday." "You should see it, Mom," Ethan chimed in. "It's actually really cool, industrial chic or whatever." My mother's expression suggested she found nothing cool about industrial anything. Well, I'm sure it suits a young person, though I still think you could have found something in a better neighborhood. The neighborhood is fine, Mom. There's a police station 2 blocks away and the building has security. Still, a young woman living alone? A young professional woman making her own choices, I corrected gently. The location is perfect for me. My father studied me over the rim of his whiskey glass. You seem different, Claire. The observation caught me off guard. Different how? More assertive. It suits you. Before I could respond, Maria appeared in the doorway. Dinner is served, Mrs. Montgomery. We moved to the dining room, where the table was set with the formal china and crystal, a clear indication that despite my mother's claim of a casual family dinner, this was meant to be a celebration. I took my usual seat across from Ethan, with our parents at either end of the table. The first course arrived, butternut squash soup, my father's favorite, and conversation flowed in safer directions. Ethan's vague plans to explore business, opportunities, Willow's upcoming yoga retreat, the latest country club gossip. I participated politely, but found myself increasingly detached from it all, as if observing a play I'd seen too many times before. It wasn't until dessert, chocolate soufflé, Ethan's favorite, that my mother finally broached the subject I'd been anticipating. So, Ethan, she began, her voice bright with practiced charm, now that you've received your trust distribution, have you given any thought to how you'll manage it? Ethan shrugged, scraping the last bit of chocolate from his plate. I've got some ideas. Maybe invest in Willow's friend's juice bar startup. Or there's this cool tech company that's developing an app for... I think what your mother means, my father interrupted, is that we hope you'll consider some conservative investments. Perhaps a meeting with our financial advisors would be prudent. Dad, I'm not going to blow through it, if that's what you're worried about. My father's expression suggested that was exactly what he was worried about. Nevertheless, it's a substantial sum, and proper management is essential. Speaking of proper management, I said, setting down my dessert spoon, I had an interesting meeting with Mr. Winters on Monday. The room went silent. My mother's smile froze, and my father's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his whiskey glass. Oh, he said, his tone carefully neutral. What about? About my portion of the Montgomery Family Legacy Trust, I replied evenly. Specifically, the clause stating it would be released upon establishment of my independent household. Ethan's eyes widened as he glanced between our parents, clearly enjoying the unfolding drama. Willow, sensing tension but unaware of its source, became suddenly fascinated by her napkin. My mother recovered first. Claire, darling, those financial matters are so complicated. I'm sure your father can explain. They're not actually that complicated, Mom. I've verified my independent residence. The funds should be released within the next week. My father set down his glass deliberately. I see Mr. Winters has been quite thorough in explaining your options. Actually, I discovered them myself when I read the documents I signed 2 years ago. The ones you told me were standard liability waivers. The accusation hung in the air between us, impossible to dismiss. We always intended to discuss the trust with you at the appropriate time, my father said finally. We simply believed that different approaches were needed for you and Ethan. Different approaches meaning automatic access for him and conditional access for me? I kept my voice level despite the emotion building in my chest. Why wasn't I trusted with the truth from the beginning? My mother interjected, her voice taking on the placating tone she used when smoothing over awkward social situations. Claire, please understand. We've always had your best interests at heart. You've always been so responsible, so capable. So, you decided I didn't deserve the same consideration as Ethan? I interrupted. You let me believe I was being excluded entirely while setting conditions on what was rightfully mine? The tension around the dining table was palpable. My father's jaw tightened as he placed his napkin beside his plate with deliberate precision. My mother's nervous fingers twisted her pearl necklace. Ethan slouched in his chair, eyes darting, between us like a spectator at a tennis match. "It wasn't about excluding you, Claire," my father finally said, his voice low and controlled. "It was about preparing you, about ensuring you developed the independence and work ethic that would serve you throughout your life. By lying to me? By letting me believe I wasn't valued as much as Ethan?" He flinched slightly at the word lying, as if I'd struck him. "We never lied. We simply withheld certain information until we felt you were ready." "Ready for what?" "Exactly?" I challenged, feeling years of quiet compliance giving way to righteous anger. "Ready to stop sending part of my paycheck home to help with expenses that didn't actually exist? Ready to stop putting my life on hold while I watched Ethan get everything handed to him?" My mother made a small, distressed sound. "Claire, that's not fair. The money you sent was always put into a separate account for you. We never spent a penny of it." This revelation caught me completely off guard. "What?" "It's true," my father confirmed, looking almost uncomfortable. "We established a separate investment account with your contributions. We thought it would be a nice surprise someday. A demonstration of how your responsible choices had paid dividends." I stared at them in disbelief. "So all this time, I've been sacrificing to help the family, and you've just been, what? Testing me? Seeing how much I was willing to give?" "It wasn't a test, darling," my mother protested, reaching across the table as if to take my hand, then withdrawing when she saw my expression. "We were trying to teach you the value of family contribution, of financial discipline. You didn't teach Ethan those lessons," I pointed out. "You gave him sports cars and international trips and now a trust fund with no strings attached." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Hey, don't drag me into this. It's not my fault they had different plans for us." "Different plans," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "Is that what we're calling blatant favoritism now?" My father's palm came down on the table harder than he probably intended, causing the crystal to rattle. "Enough," he said sharply. "This was never about favoritism, Claire. This was about recognizing that you and your brother have fundamentally different strengths and weaknesses, different needs. And who decided what those needs were? Who decided that I needed to be kept in the dark, manipulated into thinking I was supporting the family when I was actually funding my own secret account?" "We are your parents," he said, as if that explained and justified everything. "We made the decisions we thought would best prepare you both for the future." For Ethan, that meant financial support because, frankly, he lacks your natural aptitude for business and financial management. For you, it meant learning self-reliance and discipline because those qualities will serve you well when you eventually take over the firm. I froze, his last words echoing in my mind. "Take over the firm? What are you talking about?" My father looked genuinely surprised by my confusion. "Surely you've realized that's where this has been heading. I've been grooming you to succeed me at Montgomery Investments since you first showed an interest in the business. Why do you think I've been so hard on you? Pushed you so much harder than anyone else?" I felt as if the room were tilting slightly, my carefully constructed understanding of my family and my place within it shifting beneath me like sand. "You never said anything about succession plans." "I didn't think I needed to," he replied. "It seemed obvious. You have the talent, the education, the work ethic. Ethan has never shown any sustained interest in the business." Ethan raised his glass in mock salute. "And thank God for that. No offense, Dad, but spending my life behind a desk reviewing portfolio reports sounds like a special kind of hell." My mother shot him a reproachful look. "Ethan, please, this is a serious discussion." "Is it?" I asked, still reeling from my father's revelation. "Because it feels like I'm just now learning about plans for my life that everyone else has apparently known about for years." "Not Everyone, Ethan interjected. This is the first I'm hearing about you taking over, though it makes sense. You've always been the golden child when it comes to business stuff. I laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. Golden child? Are you serious? I've spent my entire life feeling like I was constantly falling short, constantly having to prove my worthwhile. You got everything handed to you. Handed to me? Ethan straightened in his chair, his casual demeanor slipping for the first time. You think it's been easy being the family disappointment? Watching you ace every test, win every award, be everything I could never be? Dad may have given me money, Claire, but he gave you his respect. I would have traded places with you in a heartbeat. The raw honesty in his voice silenced me momentarily. I'd been so focused on the material advantages he'd received that I'd never considered how he might have experienced our parents' different expectations. My father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional turn the conversation had taken. Perhaps we should all take a step back. This isn't how tonight was meant to go. How was it meant to go, I asked. Another celebration of Ethan while the rest of us played our assigned roles? The proud parents? The supportive sister? You make us sound so calculated, my mother said, hurt evident in her voice. We love you both. We've only ever wanted what's best for both our children. Then why the secrecy? Why not be honest with me from the beginning about the trust, about this supposed succession plan, about the account you created with my contributions? Because, my father said, his voice suddenly weary, we were afraid of exactly this reaction. We were afraid that if you knew everything was planned out, if you had guaranteed financial support regardless of your choices, you might not develop the hunger, the drive that's necessary to succeed in this business. The world doesn't reward people who expect things to be handed to them, Claire. So instead, you manipulated me. You let me believe I needed to earn my place in this family while Ethan got a free pass. No one got a free pass, my father insisted. Ethan's trust comes with its own set of expectations, just different ones. What expectations? I challenged, looking at my brother. Have you had to meet any conditions to receive your trust fund, Ethan? He had the grace to look sheepish. Not exactly. Though Dad's been pushing me to come up with a business plan or something before I access the money. A suggestion, my father clarified. Not a requirement. Of course not, I said, rising from my chair. Heaven forbid Ethan face actual consequences or conditions. Where are you going? My mother asked, alarm evident in her voice. Claire, please, we haven't finished our discussion. I think we've discussed enough for one evening, I replied, gathering my purse. I need some time to process everything I've learned tonight. My father stood as well, his expression a complex mixture of frustration and what might have been regret. Claire, despite how it may appear, everything we've done has been with your best interests at heart. You're the future of Montgomery Investments. Everything, the different expectations, the trust conditions, all of it, was designed to prepare you for that responsibility. I met his gaze steadily. You should have trusted me with the truth. You should have given me the choice to accept that future, not manipulated me toward it. As I turned to leave, Ethan surprised me by standing as well. I'll walk you out, he said, ignoring my mother's protests that I shouldn't leave yet, that we needed to clear the air completely. In the foyer, as I retrieved my umbrella from the stand, Ethan spoke quietly. For what it's worth, I didn't know about any of this. The succession plan, the secret account with your contributions. None of it. I believe you, I said, and realized I meant it. Ethan had many flaws, but deception had never been one of them. If anything, he was too transparent, too unfiltered in his approach to life. And for what it's worth, he continued, hands shoved awkwardly in his pockets, I've always admired you. Even when I was being a complete pain in the ass, I knew you were the one who had it together, who was going somewhere. The unexpected sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Thanks, Ethan. That actually means a lot. He nodded, then surprised me further by giving me a quick, slightly clumsy hug. "Don't be too hard on them," he murmured. "They're controlling and manipulative as hell, but they do love you. Probably more than me, if we're being honest." I pulled back, studying his face. "It was never a competition, Ethan. At least it shouldn't have been." "Yeah, well," he shrugged, a familiar gesture that somehow contained both resignation and acceptance. "Family's complicated, right?" As I stepped out into the rainy night, umbrella raised against the persistent drizzle, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of receiving more genuine understanding from my supposedly irresponsible brother than from the parents who claimed to have been preparing me for greatness all along. The drive back to my loft was a blur of rain-slicked streets and tumultuous thoughts. I barely registered the familiar landmarks of downtown as I navigated through traffic, my mind replaying fragments of the evening's revelations on an endless loop. My father's assertion that he'd been grooming me to take over the company. My mother's claim that they'd been saving my family contributions in a separate account. Ethan's unexpected moment of vulnerability in the foyer. It was past 11 when I finally parked in the underground garage of my building, feeling emotionally drained yet somehow more alert than I'd been in years, as if scales had fallen from my eyes. The elevator ride to my floor seemed interminable, and when I finally unlocked my door, the emptiness of my new home felt both welcome and overwhelming. I kicked off my heels, poured myself a generous glass of wine, and curled up on the window seat that had become my favorite spot in the loft. The city sprawled below, a constellation of lights blurred by rain streaking the glass. For the first time since discovering the trust's hidden clause, I allowed myself to fully feel everything. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, and beneath it all, a strange undercurrent of relief. At least now I knew the truth, or some version of it. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I considered ignoring it, assuming it would be my mother attempting to smooth things over, or my father trying to justify their decisions. But when I glanced at the screen, I was surprised to see Mr. Winters's name. "Claire," he said when I answered, his voice apologetic. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "It's fine," I assured him, taking a sip of wine. "I just got home." "From your parents, I presume." When I didn't immediately respond, he sighed. "I imagined tonight might be difficult. How did it go?" "About as well as could be expected when someone discovers their entire family dynamic has been built on manipulation and hidden agendas." "That bad?" I laughed despite myself. "Worse, probably. Did you know they've apparently been saving the money I've been sending home all these years? In some secret account they never told me about?" There was a pause on the line. "I was aware of the account, yes, though I advised your father multiple times to disclose it to you." "And the succession plan? Was that real, or just another justification for their behavior?" "Very real," Mr. Winters confirmed. "Richard has been planning to hand over leadership of Montgomery Investments to you for at least the past 5 years. It's written into his formal succession documentation." I took another long sip of wine, trying to reconcile this information with my long-held perception of being the less favored child. "Why are you calling, Mr. Winters? Just to check on the fallout?" "Actually, I'm calling because there's something else you should know. Something that might provide additional context for your parents' actions, though it doesn't excuse their lack of transparency." My grip tightened on the phone. "I'm listening." "Your brother's trust fund. It isn't just $100,000. It's $100,000 now, with additional distributions scheduled at specific ages: 30, 35, and 40. How much in total? $500,000 over his lifetime." The figure hung in the air between us, momentarily stealing my breath. $500,000. More money than most people would ever see in their lives, handed to Ethan simply for existing. "And my trust? Is it the same amount?" Mr. Winters hesitated. "No, Claire, your trust is structured differently. Of course it is, I said bitterly. Let me guess. More conditions, more hoops to jump through? Not exactly. Your trust currently holds $250,000. I nearly dropped my wine glass. What? With the condition that you establish your independent household now met, you'll receive $100,000 immediately, the same as Ethan's first distribution. But the remaining $150,000 is designated as business capital in the trust documents, to be released when you accept a managing partnership at Montgomery Investments. My mind raced, trying to absorb this new information. So they've planned out my entire future, financially incentivizing me to follow their predetermined path. I understand how it appears, Mr. Winters said carefully. But I've known your father for 40 years, Claire. This wasn't just about control. Richard genuinely believes, that you have the talent and drive to not just run the company, but to take it to new heights. The trust was structured to support that vision. A vision he never bothered sharing with me, I pointed out. A vision that assumed I would want the same things he wanted for me. Yes, and that's where I've always disagreed with his approach. I believe you deserve to know the full picture from the beginning. I was silent for a moment, processing everything. Is there anything else I should know? Any other secrets or conditions I should be aware of? Mr. Winters cleared his throat. Just one more thing. Your contribution account, the one your mother mentioned, currently holds just over $75,000. Your parents have been investing your monthly contributions conservatively but effectively. It's legally yours, accessible whenever you want it. My head spun with the implications. Between the first trust distribution and this unexpected savings account, I would soon have access to $175,000, far more than I had ever imagined possessing. At 27. The amount represented both freedom and an uncomfortable truth. My parents had been planning for my financial security all along, just not in the way I had understood. I know this is a lot to take in, Mr. Winters said gently, when I didn't respond, and I want to be clear that I'm telling you this not to defend your parents' methods, but because I believe you deserve to have all the facts as you decide how to move forward. Thank you, I managed. I appreciate your honesty. After we hung up, I remained at the window for hours, watching the rain gradually subside, leaving the city glistening under streetlights. The wine in my glass went untouched as I tried to reconcile everything I had learned with the narrative I had constructed about my place in the family. My parents had manipulated me, yes. They had withheld crucial information and allowed me to believe things that weren't true. But their motivation wasn't what I had always assumed. It wasn't that they valued me less than Ethan or saw me as undeserving. If anything, they had placed higher expectations on me precisely because they valued what I could become. They had shaped my path with deliberate, if misguided, intention. The realization didn't erase the hurt or justify their deception, but it shifted something fundamental in my understanding. The story I had told myself for years, that I was the overlooked daughter, the responsible one who would never measure up to her golden brother, was incomplete at best, fiction at worst. Around 3 a.m, exhaustion finally overcame my racing thoughts. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers tight around me, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The insistent buzz of my phone woke me shortly after 9. Groggy and disoriented, I fumbled for it on the nightstand, squinting at the screen. It was Ethan. "Hey, are you awake?" he asked when I answered. "I am now," I mumbled, pushing myself up against the headboard. "What's going on?" "I just wanted to check on you. Things got pretty intense last night." The concern in his voice was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I'm processing," I told him honestly. "It was a lot to take in." "Yeah, no kidding. Dad's been pacing around the house all morning, looking like he's about to have a coronary. Mom keeps rearranging flowers and pretending everything's fine. It's super weird." Despite everything, I found myself smiling at the image. They're not used to being confronted. Definitely not, Ethan agreed. Listen, I was thinking, do you want to grab lunch? Just us. No parents, no trust fund drama, just brother and sister catching up. The invitation surprised me. Ethan and I had never been particularly close. Our relationship defined more by our parents' different expectations than by any genuine connection between us. Sure, I heard myself say. That would be nice. Cool. There's this new place near your loft. The Urban Table? Meet you there at 1? After hanging up, I lay back against the pillows, contemplating this unexpected development. Perhaps the revelations of the previous night had shifted something for Ethan as well, opened a door to a relationship unburdened by our parents' comparative metrics and manipulations. My phone buzzed again with a text. This time it was my father. Claire, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss last night further. Perhaps dinner next week, just the two of us. There are things about the company and your future there that we should address properly. I read the message several times. No apology, no acknowledgement of how their deception had affected me. Just a business-like request to move forward with discussions about the company. Typical Richard Montgomery, always focused on the strategic. Objective emotional fallout be damned. Another text arrived moments later, this one from my mother. Darling, I'm so sorry about how things unfolded last night. We never meant to hurt you. Everything we did was out of love, however misguided it might seem. Please don't shut us out. Family is everything. Love, Mom. At least there was an apology, though it came with the familiar refrain about family that had been used to justify so much over the years. I set the phone aside without responding to either message, needing more time to decide how I wanted to proceed. As I showered and dressed for my lunch with Ethan, I found myself contemplating possibilities I hadn't considered before. With access to the trust money and my contribution account, I had options beyond what I had imagined. I could leave Montgomery Investments and start my own firm. I could take time off to travel or pursue other interests. I could buy property instead of renting. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel constrained by the path my parents had laid out for me. Whether I ultimately chose to follow that path or forge my own was now truly my decision. A realization. That felt both terrifying and exhilarating as I stepped out into the crisp autumn morning, ready to meet my brother as equals for perhaps the first time in our lives. The Urban Table was busier than I'd expected for a Saturday afternoon. Industrial chic with exposed brick walls and hanging plants, it embodied the revitalized downtown aesthetic that had drawn me to the area. I spotted Ethan already seated at a corner table, scrolling through his phone. He looked different somehow, more subdued than his usual boisterous self, dressed in a simple button-down rather than his typical designer casual wear. "Hey," he said, standing awkwardly as I approached. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually come." "I said I would," I replied, sliding into the chair across from him. "I keep my commitments." He winced slightly. "Yeah, that's kind of your thing, isn't it? Reliability, dependability, all those qualities I apparently never developed." The self-awareness in his tone caught me off guard. "Are we starting with the heavy stuff immediately? Because I was hoping to at least order a drink first." A genuine smile broke across his face. "Fair enough. They have great cocktails here, by the way. I've already ordered a bourbon smash." I signaled the waiter and requested a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, then studied my brother across the table. "So how much trouble am I in with the parental units? Scale of 1 to 10. Ethan chuckled. "Mom's at about an 8. Keeps talking about family bonds and healing the rift. Dad's harder to read. Outwardly, he's all business, like nothing happened, but I caught him staring at your empty chair at breakfast this morning. I think you really rattled him." "Good," I said, accepting my wine from the returning waiter. "He deserves to be rattled, after everything they kept from me." Ethan nodded, taking a sip of his cocktail. "Yeah, about that. I owe you an apology, too. I had no idea about most of it, but I should have questioned things more. The car, the trips, the lack of expectations. I just took it all as my due, you know? Classic entitled youngest child. You were raised to be entitled, I pointed out. That's not entirely your fault. Maybe not, but I'm 25 now, old enough to recognize the uneven playing field. He leaned forward, his expression uncharacteristically serious. And for what it's worth, I think you got the raw end of the deal. I raised an eyebrow. Even with my trust potentially being larger than yours in the long run? That's just money, he said with a dismissive wave. I'm talking about the pressure, the expectations, the way they've had your whole life mapped out since you were a kid. At least I got freedom, even if it came with an implicit understanding that they didn't expect much from me. The insight surprised me. I'd spent so long envying Ethan's material advantages and apparent favored status that I'd never considered. He might envy aspects of my situation. Freedom has its value, I acknowledged. Though I might have appreciated having both freedom and financial support, like some people I could mention. He had the grace to look sheepish. Yeah, I definitely won the financial lottery of life. But look at you now. You've got your fancy MBA, your own place, and apparently a fast track to running the company someday. Meanwhile, I've got, he trailed off, gesturing vaguely. A trust fund, I supplied. A trust fund and zero direction, he corrected. Not as glamorous as it sounds. We paused as the waiter returned to take our lunch orders, then fell into easier conversation about my loft, his latest misadventures with Willow, who was apparently now exploring a career as a crystal healer, and neutral childhood memories that didn't touch on the more painful aspects of our upbringing. It wasn't until we were sharing a dessert, a ridiculously decadent chocolate tart, that Ethan broached the serious topic again. So, what are you going to do? He asked, scraping up a bit of chocolate ganache. About Mom and Dad, I mean, and the company, and all of it. I considered the question, realizing I'd been wrestling with it since leaving my parents' house the night before. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet. Part of me wants to walk away completely. Take my trust money and contribution account and start fresh somewhere else. Maybe even open my own firm. You'd be good at that, Ethan said, and the simple vote of confidence warmed me unexpectedly. But another part of me thinks that would be letting them win in a way, confirming their belief that I'm too emotional or reactionary to handle the responsibility they've planned for me. Plus, you'd actually miss the work, Ethan observed shrewdly. Don't pretend you wouldn't. You've always been a finance nerd at heart. I smiled reluctantly. Maybe. But I'd want it on my terms, not as the fulfillment of some grand plan they designed without my input. So tell them that, he suggested, as if it were the most obvious solution in the world. Set your own conditions for taking over eventually. You've got leverage now. They know you're willing to walk away if things don't change. The simplicity of his advice struck me. Perhaps it really was that straightforward. Not walking away entirely, but renegotiating the terms of my relationship with my parents and my role in the family business. When did you get so insightful? I asked, only half joking. He shrugged. I've had a lot of therapy. Turns out having zero expectations placed on you creates its own kind of identity crisis. Who knew? After lunch, we walked together along the riverfront, the afternoon sun breaking through clouds to cast the city in a golden light. It was the longest conversation Ethan and I had shared in years, possibly ever, unmediated by our parents' presence or expectations. I've been thinking about doing something with my trust money, Ethan said as we leaned against the railing, watching boats navigate the river below. Something more meaningful than investing in juice bars or whatever. Like what? He hesitated, suddenly looking vulnerable. Promise not to laugh? I promised to try very hard not to laugh, I countered, which earned me a small smile. I've been talking to this organization that works with kids from low-income neighborhoods, teaching financial literacy, entrepreneurship, that kind of stuff. They need funding to expand their program, and I thought, well, Why not put some of my unearned privilege to good use, right? I stared at him, genuinely surprised. Ethan, that's actually really commendable. Don't sound so shocked, he protested, though he looked pleased by my approval. I do occasionally have non-self-centered thoughts. Apparently so. I bumped his shoulder lightly with mine. For what it's worth, I think it's a great idea. Those kids would be lucky to have your support. Maybe you could help too, he suggested cautiously. Not with money necessarily, but with expertise. You're the financial whiz in the family. The idea of collaborating with Ethan on something meaningful, something entirely separate from our parents' influence or expectations, held an unexpected appeal. I'd like that, I said sincerely. As we parted ways later that afternoon, Ethan surprised me with a quick, awkward hug. Don't be too hard on them, he said quietly. They're flawed as hell, but they do love us. In their own weird, controlling, emotionally stunted way. I laughed despite myself. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. And hey, he added, already walking backward toward his car, if you do decide to tell them to go to hell and start your own firm, can I be your first client? I suddenly find myself with a significant sum to invest. I'll consider it, I called after him. But I charge higher fees for difficult clients. His laughter carried back to me on the autumn breeze, a sound so free and genuine that I couldn't help smiling in return. Back at my loft, I found myself in a contemplative mood. The conversation with Ethan had shifted something in me, offered a perspective I hadn't fully considered before. I'd been so focused on how my parents' different treatment had affected me that I'd never truly considered its impact on him. The implicit message that he wasn't capable or responsible enough to meet higher expectations. Perhaps there was something to be gained by confronting this together. By acknowledging how the patterns established in our childhood had shaped both of us in different but equally profound ways. With that thought in mind, I finally responded to my parents' messages. To my father, I wrote, I'm available for dinner. On Wednesday, Montgomery Steakhouse at 7, we have a lot to discuss about the future, mine and the company's. Neutral territory, but a place with significance to our family. The restaurant where we'd celebrated every major Montgomery Investments milestone. To my mother, my response was briefer but more personal. I'm not shutting you out. I'm establishing boundaries. There's a difference. I need time, but I'm open to talking when you're ready to truly listen. After sending both messages, I opened my laptop and pulled up a document I'd started the night before. A list of conditions and expectations for my continued involvement with Montgomery Investments. If I was going to remain with the company, potentially taking over leadership someday, it would be as a partner rather than a pawn, with full transparency and genuine respect for my autonomy. The sun was setting over the city skyline, painting my loft in shades of amber and gold as I worked on articulating exactly what I wanted from my future. For the first time, I wasn't trying to earn approval or meet expectations set by others. I was defining success on my own terms, with the clarity that came from finally understanding the hidden clauses in my family's dynamics. The trust fund revelation had started as a painful discovery of inequity, but it had become something else. Entirely, a catalyst for honesty, for boundary setting, for reclaiming my agency in both my professional and personal life. Whatever came next, whether reconciliation or separation, it would be my choice. And that realization, more than any financial windfall, felt like the true inheritance I'd been seeking all along. Wednesday evening arrived with unexpected trepidation coursing through my veins. I'd faced countless high-stakes client meetings, delivered presentations to rooms full of skeptical investors, even navigated the cutthroat politics of the financial world as a young woman in a predominantly male industry. Yet somehow, the prospect of dinner with my father, a dinner where I would be setting terms rather than accepting them, felt more daunting than any professional challenge I'd encountered. I arrived at Montgomery Steakhouse 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained since childhood. My father had always insisted that punctuality was a form of respect, and being early demonstrated preparation and control. I'd internalized this lesson so thoroughly that even now, when I was deliberately challenging his authority, I couldn't bring myself to arrive even fashionably late. The maitre d' recognized me immediately. "Ms. Montgomery, welcome. Your father has already arrived and is waiting in your usual booth." Of course he had beaten me here. Another power move in the endless chess game of our relationship. My father stood as I approached the table, his expression carefully neutral. He was impeccably dressed as always in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair precisely combed, his posture military straight despite his 63 years. "Claire," he said, his voice betraying nothing of the tension from our last encounter. "You look well." "Thank you," I replied, sliding into the booth across from him. A glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, my preferred wine, was already waiting for me. Another calculated gesture, reminding me that he knew me, had shaped me in ways both obvious and subtle. The first few minutes passed in practiced small talk, observations about the restaurant's recent renovation, comments on the unseasonably warm weather, brief mentions of a few shared clients. It was the social dance we had perfected over years of family dinners and business functions, a cordial veneer masking the undercurrents. After we ordered, filet mignon for him, salmon for me, both choices as predictable as our opening conversation, he finally broached the real subject. "I've had time to reflect on our discussion Friday night," he began, folding his hands on the table. "I understand your frustration with how information was managed. Perhaps there were better approaches we could have taken." Coming from Richard Montgomery, this qualified acknowledgement was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. I took a sip of wine, letting the moment stretch. It wasn't just about information being managed, Dad. It was about autonomy, about respect. You and Mom made decisions about my life, my future, without including me in the conversation. You created tests and conditions I didn't know I was being subjected to. He frowned slightly. We were trying to protect you, to prepare you. By deceiving me? By letting me believe I was supporting the family financially when you were actually just testing my willingness to sacrifice? I kept my voice low, mindful of the other diners, but couldn't entirely mask the intensity of my feelings. It wasn't a test, Claire. It was... He paused, seeming to search for words that rarely eluded him. It was a lesson in responsibility, in understanding that success comes with obligations to those around you. A lesson you didn't feel, Ethan, needed to learn? He sighed, a rare display of weariness. Your brother and you are different people with different strengths, different needs. But that's just it, Dad. You decided what our needs were. You assigned us roles, the responsible one and the free spirit, and then shaped everything to reinforce those designations. Did it ever occur to you that I might have wanted some of the freedom Ethan was given? That he might have benefited from some of the responsibility placed on me? Our entrees arrived, providing a momentary reprieve from the intensity of the conversation. I watched as my father methodically cut into his steak, his movements precise and controlled. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly. "I've reviewed your performance records at the firm," he said, as if changing the subject entirely. "Your client retention rate is exceptional. The Wilson portfolio restructuring was particularly impressive. Even Parker in the senior division commented on your approach. I recognized the pivot for what it was, a retreat to familiar territory, to metrics and performance evaluations, where emotional complexities could be set aside in favor of quantifiable results. Dad, I didn't come here to discuss my performance. Reviews. No, he agreed, setting down his fork. You came to discuss your future with Montgomery Investments. And I'm telling you that your future there is exceptionally bright. The board has already approved fast-tracking you to junior partner by the end of the year, with senior partnership to follow within 3 years if you maintain your current trajectory. The news should have thrilled me. It was everything I had. Worked toward professionally, recognition, advancement, the path to eventual leadership. Yet it felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that it had been predetermined, part of a plan I'd had no voice in creating. "I've prepared some thoughts on that subject," I said, reaching into my purse for the document I'd refined over the past few days. I placed it on the table between us, 3 pages of cleanly formatted text outlining my conditions for remaining with the firm. "I'd like you to review these before we discuss next steps." He looked momentarily taken aback, then adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the document. I watched his expression as he read, noting the slight tightening around his mouth, the almost imperceptible raise of his eyebrows at certain points. When he finished, he set the pages down carefully and removed his glasses. "These are substantial requests, Claire. The autonomy over client selection, the accelerated timeline to senior partnership, the board seat." He tapped the document with one finger. "And this proposal to restructure the mentorship program to ensure gender equity, that would require significant policy changes." "Yes," I agreed simply. "It would. May I ask what happens if these conditions aren't met to your satisfaction?" His tone was measured, revealing nothing of his thoughts on my proposals. I met his gaze directly. "Then I'll take my trust fund distribution, my contribution account funds, and my client relationships, and establish my own firm. I already have preliminary paperwork drafted." For the first time in my adult life, I saw genuine surprise flash across my father's face. "You would leave? Start a competing firm?" "I would create my own path," I corrected, "just as you did when you were my age." The parallel wasn't lost on him. My father had broken from his own family's legal practice to establish Montgomery Investments, against his father's explicit wishes. It was a chapter of family history often recounted at business anniversaries, held up as evidence of the Montgomery entrepreneurial spirit, at least when applied to the patriarchal line. "I see," he said after a long moment. He took a deliberate sip of his scotch, then set the glass down with precision. "And if these conditions were met, what then?" "Then I would commit fully to the succession plan. I would work with you to ensure a smooth transition of leadership over the next 5 to 7 years. I would preserve your legacy while building my own." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. It was not the response I had anticipated. "You've clearly given this considerable thought," he said finally. "I'll need to review these proposals more thoroughly, discuss some of them with the board. But Claire?" He paused, meeting my eyes with unexpected directness. "I'm proud of you. This..." He gestured to the document between us. "This is exactly why you're the right person to lead Montgomery Investments into its next chapter." The words I had longed to hear for years, "I'm proud of you," landed with complex impact, simultaneously validating and unsettling. I had spent so long seeking his approval that receiving it now, in response to my most direct challenge to his authority, felt like the final irony in our complicated relationship. "Thank you," I said simply, uncertain how else to respond. He picked up his scotch again, something almost like a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose I should have expected this. You are my daughter, after all." The weeks that followed my dinner with my father passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, he took my proposals seriously, presenting them to the board with what Mr. Winters later described as uncharacteristic enthusiasm. Most of my conditions were approved with minimal pushback: the accelerated partnership timeline, the restructured mentorship program, even the board seat, though that would come with certain stipulations regarding tenure and performance metrics. Meanwhile, the trust fund distribution and my contribution account were released as promised. The combined sum, $175,000, now sat in my personal investment account, a financial cushion I had never imagined possessing at 27. It represented both security and possibility, a tangible reminder that I now had options beyond the path that had been predetermined for me. The most unexpected development, however, came from my mother. 3 days after my dinner with my father, she asked if she could visit my loft, a request so unprecedented that I initially thought I had misheard her. "Your new home," she clarified over the phone, her voice carefully modulated to hide any judgment. "I'd like to see where you're living now. Perhaps bring a housewarming gift." I agreed with hesitation, uncertain what to expect from this uncharacteristic outreach. When she arrived that Saturday afternoon, I was struck by how out of place she looked in the industrial elevator of my building, her designer pantsuit and pearls at odds with the exposed brick and metal aesthetic. "It's very urban," she commented as I gave her a tour of my loft. But instead of the criticism I anticipated, she added, "But it suits you somehow. It has character." We settled on my couch with tea served in the crystal glasses she had given me, her contribution to my new home, along with a surprisingly tasteful abstract painting that complemented my decor far better than anything I would have expected her to choose. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation at dinner," she began, cradling her teacup with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "About the different ways we've treated you and Ethan over the years." I remained silent, giving her space to continue. "When you were born," she said, her gaze distant with memory, "your father was already building the business. He worked such long hours, was so driven. I was often alone with you, trying to figure out motherhood without much help." She smiled faintly. "But you were such an easy baby, so self-sufficient even then. You could entertain yourself for hours with your blocks and books." She set her teacup down carefully. "When Ethan came along 4 years later, things were different. The business was established, your father was home more, and Ethan was challenging, colicky, demanding, constantly needing attention. He struggled with everything that seemed to come naturally to you." "So you compensated," I said, understanding dawning. "You gave him more because he seemed to need more." "Yes," she admitted. "And over time, it became a pattern. The more capable you proved yourself to be, the more we leaned on that capability. The more Ethan struggled, the more we intervened. We never stopped to consider how it might look from your perspective, that we were rewarding his difficulties and taking your strengths for granted." The acknowledgement was more than I had expected, a level of self-awareness I hadn't thought my mother possessed. "It hurt," I said simply, watching him receive automatically what I had to earn repeatedly. "I know that now," she replied, her voice softening. "And I'm sorry, Claire, truly. We thought we were preparing you both for the future in the ways you each needed. We never intended to make you feel less valued." It wasn't a perfect apology. There was still an undercurrent of justification in her explanation. But it was genuine in a way my mother rarely allowed herself to be. I realized she was trying, in her limited emotional vocabulary, to bridge the gap between us. "I'm not looking for special treatment, Mom," I told her. "Just equal consideration, equal respect for my choices and my autonomy. I'm trying to understand that," she said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her pants, a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. "It's not easy for me. I've spent so many years believing I knew what was best for both of you. And now?" She looked around my loft, taking in the space I had created for myself, independent of her influence or approval. "Now I'm beginning to see that you know what's best for yourself. That perhaps you always have." It wasn't everything, but it was a start. An acknowledgement that our relationship needed to evolve beyond the parameters she and my father had established in my childhood. We spent the rest of the afternoon in cautious conversation, carefully avoiding the more volatile topics, but finding small points of connection I hadn't known were possible. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "Your father mentioned your proposals for the company. He's impressed, though he'd never admit it outright. You've surprised him." "Good," I said with a small smile. He spent too long thinking he can predict my every move. We both have, she acknowledged, then hesitated before adding, I hope this new chapter brings you happiness, Claire, whatever form that takes. The sentiment seemed genuine, free from the usual qualifications and expectations that typically accompanied her expressions of maternal concern. I thanked her, and for the first time in years, the hug we exchanged felt less like an obligation and more like a choice. The following week brought another unexpected development. Ethan called to inform me that he had committed $50,000 of his trust fund to the youth financial literacy program he had mentioned, and they had invited him to join their board of directors. They want me to actually help make decisions, he said, sounding equal parts terrified and exhilarated. Me, making responsible choices about an organization's future. Can you believe it? Actually, I can, I told him, and meant it. The Ethan, who had emerged since our confrontation with our parents, was thoughtful in ways I hadn't given him credit for, capable of insights and growth I hadn't anticipated. I'm going to need your help, he admitted. I don't know the first thing about serving on a board or analyzing program effectiveness or any of that responsible adult stuff you're so good at. I laughed. I'll help you. But Ethan, don't sell yourself short. You bring something valuable to the table too. Creativity, enthusiasm, a fresh perspective. Those kids will relate to you in ways they might not to traditional financial advisors. There was a pause on the line. Thanks for that, he said finally, his voice uncharacteristically serious. For seeing something in me besides the family screw-up. We've both been breaking out of the boxes they put us in, I observed. It's kind of liberating, isn't it? Terrifying, he corrected. But yeah, liberating too. As autumn gave way to winter, I found myself settling into new rhythms, both professional and personal. At work, my role was expanding, with new responsibilities and authority that came with my impending partnership. At home, my loft had become a true sanctuary, filled with books and art and furniture chosen solely for my own pleasure, rather than to meet anyone else's aesthetic expectations. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve in fits and starts. There were still moments of tension, particularly with my father, who struggled to relinquish control over areas I had claimed as my own domain. My mother tried harder, making genuine, if sometimes awkward, attempts to connect with me as an adult, rather than as the dutiful daughter she had always expected me to be. Most surprising was my strengthening bond with Ethan. We had begun meeting regularly for lunch or drinks, developing a sibling relationship based on mutual respect rather than the comparison and competition that had defined our earlier interactions. He was finding his own path, one that involved more responsibility and purpose than anyone in our family had expected from him, and watching him grow into his potential was unexpectedly rewarding. 1 year after discovering the hidden clause, in my trust fund, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my loft, watching snow drift lazily onto the downtown streets below. The city looked magical in winter twilight, streetlights casting golden pools on freshly fallen snow, holiday decorations twinkling in storefronts and along building facades. In the reflection of the glass, I could see my home behind me, warm, inviting, entirely my own. So much had changed in 12 months. I had officially become the youngest partner in Montgomery Investments' history, with a portfolio of clients that included some of the firm's most prestigious accounts. The mentorship program I'd proposed for young women in finance was thriving, with 15 participants currently moving through the structured curriculum I'd developed. My board seat had given me unexpected influence over the company's strategic direction, pushing it toward more innovative investment approaches and socially responsible policies. But the professional accomplishments, satisfying as they were, paled in comparison to the personal growth I'd experienced. The Claire Montgomery who had signed those documents without reading them 2 years ago, the dutiful daughter who had accepted inequality as her due, felt like a distant acquaintance now, someone I had known but could no longer fully understand. My phone chimed with a text from Ethan. Running 10 min late, Willow insisted on making her special eggnog to bring. Pray for us all. I smiled, setting my wine glass on the kitchen counter to prepare for their arrival. Tonight was our new tradition, a siblings-only Christmas celebration the weekend before we would join our parents for the official family holiday. It had been Ethan's idea, a way to ensure we maintained our newfound connection regardless of the occasionally turbulent dynamics with our parents. The buzzer sounded shortly after, and I pressed the button to allow them up. Moments later, Ethan burst through the door in a flurry of cold air and enthusiasm, his arms laden with brightly wrapped packages. Willow followed more sedately, carefully, balancing a large thermos that presumably contained the dreaded eggnog. "Merry almost Christmas," Ethan announced, depositing the gifts under the small but elegantly decorated tree in the corner of my loft. "The place looks amazing, Claire," he wasn't wrong. I'd embraced the holiday fully this year, adorning my industrial space with a tasteful blend of traditional and modern decorations. Pine garlands interwoven with fairy lights along the exposed beams, vintage ornaments collected from antique, shops displayed in a large glass bowl, a wreath of eucalyptus and silver bells on my door. "Thanks for having us," Willow said, offering the thermos with solemn ceremony. "I've infused the eggnog with adaptogenic herbs and blessed it under the full moon." I accepted it with appropriate gravity, having learned that Willow's eccentricities came from a genuine place. "That sounds energetically balanced. I'm sure it will be delicious." Ethan caught my eye over her shoulder and mouthed, "It's lethal," with an exaggerated grimace that made me struggle not to laugh. As we settled around the living area with drinks, store-bought wine for Ethan and me, the mysterious eggnog for Willow, I was struck by how comfortable this felt. This new version of family we were creating between us, undefined by our parents' expectations or our childhood roles. "So," Ethan said, leaning back against the couch cushions, "big news on my front. The financial literacy program is expanding to 3 more schools next semester. The foundation approved our full funding request." "Ethan, that's wonderful," I exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. The program had become his passion over the past year, evolving from a simple donation into a hands-on commitment that had revealed leadership skills none of us had known he possessed. "Couldn't have done it without your help on the proposal," he said, raising his glass in my direction. "Your spreadsheet wizardry sealed the deal." "Team effort," I demurred, though I was proud of the role I'd played in helping him develop a sustainable financial model for the program's expansion. "How are the kids responding to the curriculum?" His face lit up as he described the progress they were seeing. Teenagers from disadvantaged backgrounds learning to budget, save, and even invest small amounts, developing skills that could potentially break generational cycles of financial insecurity. Willow, who had initially seemed skeptical of Ethan's involvement in something so establishment, now volunteered regularly, teaching meditation techniques to help the students manage financial anxiety. "What about you?" he asked eventually. "How are things with Dad and the succession plan?" I took a thoughtful sip of wine. "Evolving. He's officially announced his 5-year timeline for retirement to the board, with me named as his successor pending continued performance benchmarks. It's still strange sometimes, working so closely with him after everything that happened. But we're finding our way." "And Mom? She mentioned something about you joining her charity committee when I talked to her yesterday." I laughed softly. "Yes, though I think she regrets asking now that I've started questioning their grant allocation process and suggesting more rigorous impact assessments. Old habits die hard." "The Montgomery women," Ethan said with a dramatic sigh, "terrorizing charitable organizations with spreadsheets and accountability metrics since 2025. The evening flowed with easy conversation and genuine laughter, so different from the tense, performative family gatherings of our childhood. When we exchanged gifts, they were thoughtful rather than extravagant. A first edition of my favorite financial theory book from Ethan, a surprisingly beautiful handmade journal from Willow, a vintage record player, and curated vinyl collection. From me to them, As they prepared to leave, snow still falling gently outside, Ethan pulled me into a hug that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. "I'm glad we found our way to this," he said quietly. "To being actual siblings instead of competitors in some weird parental approval Olympics." "Me too," I replied, meaning it completely. After they left, I curled up by the window again with a fresh glass of wine, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The hidden clause in my trust fund had been the catalyst, but the real transformation had come from within, from finding the courage to question the narrative I'd been given, to demand more than the role I'd been assigned. I thought about the conversation I'd had with my father earlier that week during our regular strategy meeting. He had looked up from the quarterly projections I'd prepared, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "You know," he'd said finally, "I've been doing this wrong all these years." "The projections?" I'd asked, confused by the non-sequitur. "Parenthood," he clarified, setting down his pen. "I thought I was preparing you for success by setting high standards, by making you earn every achievement. I thought I was doing Ethan a favor by sheltering him from pressure." He shook his head slowly. "I nearly lost you both with those misguided assumptions." The admission had stunned me into momentary silence. My father had never been one for emotional revelations or acknowledgments of error. "We're finding our way now," I'd told him, echoing what I would later say to Ethan. "All of us." He'd nodded, a hint of something that might have been pride in his eyes. "You've surpassed every expectation I ever had for you, Claire. Not because you've met the benchmarks I set, but because you've had the courage to set your own." The compliment had warmed me in a way his approval never had before, perhaps because I no longer needed it to validate my worth. My gaze drifted to the snow-covered city beyond my window, to the life I was building on my own terms. The trust fund money had given me options, but the real wealth had come from discovering my own value, separate from family expectations, professional achievements, or financial assets. Sometimes I still wondered how things might have unfolded if I had never discovered that hidden clause, if I had continued along the path of least resistance, accepting the inequity as my due. But those thoughts no longer carried the weight of regret or resentment. Instead, they reminded me of how far I had come, and of the power that comes from reading the fine print of your own life, from questioning the terms you've been given and having the courage to renegotiate when necessary. As the snow continued to fall, transforming the familiar cityscape into something new and beautiful, I raised my glass in a silent toast to hidden clauses, to difficult questions, and to the unexpected freedom that comes from finally writing your own terms. 5 years to the day after discovering the hidden clause, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Heights Country Club, facing a room full of clients, colleagues, and industry leaders. The occasion, my father's retirement and the official announcement of my ascension to CEO of Montgomery Investments. My father sat in the front row, silver hair now fully white, his expression a complex mixture of pride, nostalgia, and that ever-present hint of calculation. Beside him, my mother dabbed discreetly at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Ethan, now a respected figure in the nonprofit sector, gave me an encouraging thumbs up from his table, where he sat with Willow and their 6-month-old daughter, Maya. As I accept this responsibility, I concluded my speech, I'm reminded of a lesson I learned 5 years ago about the power of hidden clauses. A knowing smile passed between my father and me. Sometimes the most important details are buried in the fine print of our lives, the conditions and expectations we don't think to question until something prompts us to look more closely. After the applause and congratulations, after the champagne, toasts and professional photographs, I found a quiet moment alone with my father on the terrace overlooking the golf course. You've carried the Montgomery name further than I ever imagined, he said, watching the sunset paint the manicured landscape in amber hues. Further than you planned, I corrected gently. He smiled, acknowledging the truth in my words. The best. Investments often exceed our projections. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew an envelope and handed it to me. One last piece of business before I officially stepped down. Inside was a legal document transferring his remaining shares in the company. To me, a significant portion I hadn't expected to receive until much later. But what caught my eye was the handwritten notepaper clipped to the corner. Claire, no conditions, no clauses, no expectations except those you set for yourself. With pride and respect, Dad, that night, as I returned to my downtown penthouse, a significant upgrade from my first loft but still distinctly mine in style and location, I reflected on how a single discovery had altered the trajectory of my life. The hidden clause that had initially seemed like evidence of my secondary status in the family had ultimately been the key to my liberation. 2 weeks later, I signed the paperwork establishing the Montgomery Foundation for Financial Empowerment, endowing it with $5 million from my personal investments. Its mission: to provide financial education and startup capital to young people from underprivileged backgrounds, with a particular focus on young women entering male-dominated fields. The first program launched under its umbrella was one Ethan and I had designed together, combining his grassroots experience with my corporate knowledge, a true blending of our different strengths, unhampered by the comparative dynamics of our childhood. At the Foundation's opening ceremony, I unveiled a plaque bearing its motto, words I had chosen with deliberate irony and genuine purpose. Read the fine print, question the terms, write your own clauses. My father, seeing it for the first time, laughed with genuine appreciation. "Touché, Claire," he murmured. "Well played indeed." My mother, standing nearby, squeezed my hand. "You've built something remarkable," she said quietly. "Something entirely your own." As I looked around at what my life had become, the career I had shaped on my terms, the foundation that would extend opportunities to others, the family relationships transformed through honesty and boundary setting, I realized that the greatest hidden clause had been the one written into my own character all along: the capacity to transform challenge into opportunity, to rewrite limiting narratives into stories of empowerment. Some inheritances, it turned out, were worth more than money, and some hidden clauses, once discovered, could set you free.